Hey guys, welcome back. So now jumping back into Justice League, and at the point where we've crossed the threshold of the year of the villain, which I'm super excited about because we're gonna see like the intersection between the writings between James Tynion, Scott Snyder, Tom King, and many others, which is paying off so much of what we've seen build up throughout DC Rebirth, but also pointing back to Final Crisis and showing us how the pre-existing history fits in with the new origin of the multiverse. But first, if you're new to the channel, be sure to subscribe to catch the spills every week, and don't forget to hit that bell up top so we can squad up in the comments for the first hour. Alright, now so as of late, with Lex Luthor in DC Rebirth, he has literally taken the term rebirth to heart, because with him recently staging his own death, which presumably had already been planned as part of the process for him to transfer into his new body, which is like your Martian human hybrid, because mainly by design of Perpetua, this hybrid is what she deemed perfect to wield the 7 hidden forces, which she had intended for her soldiers to protect her undying multiverse from judgment which would come from the source. But with Lex Luthor going mad OP and really having no use of his old body, he then decided to use it as this theatrical sacrifice to make himself seem like the hero and make the Justice League appear as if they're the true villain. And doing so with telling many truths, because they did break the source wall, and Lex Luthor absolutely did help with that, but it served its purpose as in making the hero seem like the bad guy, which is the perfect incentive that he needed after dumping his entire fortune onto a large number of villains which he had handpicked who were deemed like the most dangerous according to Amanda Waller. And him doing that forced the hand of the heroes to grab as much help as they can, of which at this time there's still one man short, and that man would be Martian Manhunter. And so now one of the last things that we had talked about with John Johns was like literally his manhunt for Lex Luthor, with him still believing that Lex was alive, and his theory really picking up steam mainly because of a lot of the urban legends that spoke of this mysterious cloaked man who was making like all the worst dreams come true. And this eventually led him to being approached by what it seemed to be Lionel Luthor, which of course is highly unlikely because Lionel Luthor is supposed to be dead. And I want to say he came back during Blackest Night, but I'm pretty sure he's dead again. But for Martian Manhunter, this encounter is a bit more threatening than what it appears to be on the surface. And to truly understand why, we gotta go back to Thanagar Prime, because back when Martian Manhunter went to Thanagar Prime with Kendra and John Stewart, not long after the arrival of the Totality, it was there that the three of them had got to the bottom of all the deception, which was all being held together by the Martian Keep. But it was from this point forward that many of the visions and flashbacks that he had been having, which prior to were just fragments of his lost memory, they had started fully forming not long after the Martian Keep had revealed to him much of the truth. And we've gone much more into the details of what the Martian Keep had shared and much of the history between young Lex and young Martian Manhunter. But in addition to that, since having the full recollection of these memories, his nightmares from these memories in captivity have been turned up another notch as well. And so for Martian Manhunter, just seeing Lionel Luthor, this allows him to get captured again. Because for John Johns, this is like one of those instances where you have a traumatic experience at a young age, and at the moment that you see something resembling that, it's like he's triggered and he just turns into this kid again. And granted, in this instance, it wasn't Lionel Luthor, it was just an android that Professor Ivo had set up in order to catch him off guard. But it worked. And so Martian Manhunter was able to get out because, you know, he's not that kid anymore, and his shape-shifting abilities between then and now are like night and day. But what's crazy is that when he finally figures out that this Lionel Luthor isn't actually Lionel Luthor, Martian Manhunter is flanked with heat vision, which is stolen from a Kryptonian, and this was done by none other than Amazo. Because at this point in time, Martian Manhunter has actually woken up in Professor Ivo's laboratory to where one of his greatest creations to date, being Amazo, is kind of moving around like his muscle. But with this Amazo, there's kind of an asterisk on it, which we'll talk about more in just a little bit. But it's here in Professor Ivo's laboratory that we discover that he's been practicing alternate methods than Lex Luthor in order to create the true apex predator. But for now, jumping over to the rest of the Justice League, at this point in time, they've made their way over to the world of Nil, which we haven't talked about in a good minute, because I believe the last time that we spoke anything even remotely close to or about Nil was probably back in Dark Knight's Metal, back when we were trying to figure out who was in the chair, of which all the clues pointed back to the Monitor, which I was right about. But with this guy dying and reforming and becoming like a whole population at one point, it was pretty tough to pin him down to like what specific state he would be in at the time. But with the World Forger bringing the Justice League here to Nil, because after Crisis on Infinite Earths, when the Monitor underwent substantial damage from the Anti-Monitor, he had reformed and established himself himself as his people here, and he did so all the way up till Final Crisis. And with the World Forger bringing the Justice League here now, Superman is one of the only ones who actually remembers this place, and mainly because during the events of Final Crisis, he had taken an offer to save Lois, and with doing so, he boarded the Ultimate Fuel, traveled through the bleed, and got upgraded to 4D vision. But the memories of this place nil are some of the things that carried over from your classic Superman, who was later merged by Mxyzptlk. And for this reason, when they arrive there, he's one of the only people who recognizes this place, or even remembers the events of Crisis initially. But not long after being there, the World Forger begins to explain the events of Crisis and Alexander Luthor Jr. And oh, like I had mentioned earlier about not knowing what state the Monitor would be in or what he would reform in during the events of Dark Knight's Metal, we actually get the answer here to why he didn't revert back to Nixuoten, or why he didn't appear as Nixuoten at that time. And the World Forger actually lets us know that it was at the time of the Dark Multiverse Rising when the Monitor had went back to his original form. And I like that Tynion kind of goes back and clears that up, because even though it wasn't that important during Dark Knight's Metal, but with so many pieces continuing on even after that narrative, it's good to see even those small pieces still line up. And it doesn't stop there, because with all the Crisis talk, like the Monitor reminds Barry Allen of his death back in Crisis on Infinite Earths, which actually freaks him out for a minute, because at the mention of it, he blanks out and he actually recalls creating that speed vortex to stop the Anti-Monitor, which at the time seemingly killed him. But as it turned out, speedsters don't die, all speedsters go to the Speed Force, and eventually they make their way back around. Which also makes me think of just Flash remembering this at all. It makes me think of him bringing back Wally West by just remembering him. But from here, the Monitor eventually agrees to help the Justice League and help his brother go against Perpetua, but from here they have to find their other brother, the Anti-Monitor. But so now getting back to Martian Manhunter, who is still in the villainous clutches of Professor Ivo. I don't know why I just felt right to say it like that just then. But with Professor Ivo, as far as him working with Lex Luthor, this is something that we've known about for a while, because Lex needed Ivo to bring back Brainiac after Brainiac's death in Justice League No Justice. But it's here that we find that Professor Ivo, he's kind of segued into his own passion project, and doing so with taking the concept of what Lex Luthor did with his own body, and Ivo applying that concept to his machines. And the way that we see this play out, it almost seems as if Professor Ivo is going to take the ability to wield these forces and put them all into Amazo, which would be insane. Oh, and this reminds me, as far as the Amazo that we're dealing with here, he's not like the Amazo that we're used to, because even though much of that credit is due to the absorption cell technology allowing him to mimic the powers of other heroes around him, this version of Amazo is more so another test subject that Professor Ivo is just looking to experiment some new information on. And speaking of new information, Professor Ivo has a lot of it, because along with working for Lex Luthor, Luthor had also passed off Lionel Luthor's research to Professor Ivo, which means that he now has all of the data from the Martian studies, with plenty of money to fund his experiments, made effective at the death of Lex Luthor. Like, this dude truly has the tools to create the true apex predator, and he's planning to use samples from Martian Manhunter to be a huge part of that. But of course, this is where Kendra comes through busting heads, because John Johns, who refused to give up on his investigation earlier, he was kind of dodging her so he can continue to look for Lex Luthor. And when she finally gets him free, this is when they figure out that this was a whole warehouse of Amazos. But like I said before, none of these are like the Amazo that we're used to, because they are smashing through them way too easily. And while they're fighting their way out of here, they kind of understand that, but also while doing so, they get a better look at Lionel's notes, of which Ivo was using as a reference, but they notice that Lionel's title for the notes were Apex Predator. And so now John Johns, he eventually gets to the point to where he's fed up, and at this point in time, they more or less figure that Professor Ivo is not physically there, but rather remotely communicating with them. But John Johns is still adamant about knowing where Lex Luthor is, to which Ivo responds that Luthor is dead. Like, we all saw it on TV, like it was on the news, and the news wouldn't lie. But after leaving there, they're met outside by this miniature Doom headquarters looking little ship. And as soon as it speaks, just saying thank you for cleaning up my mess for me, John and Kendra recognize that voice, because it's the voice of Lex Luthor, who goes on to mention that he agrees to meet with John, which totally shocks Kendra because she thought that he was dead for real. But John, he's more so shocked at the fact that he can see now that Luthor has truly underwent his full transformation, which is crazy. But that'll do it for this one, guys. There's so much more we got to get into for the year of the villain, and like, we haven't even touched on Leviathan yet, but we'll get to it soon. But that'll do it for this one, guys. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments, and we'll do it again on the next one. Alright, later.